Hello there. You are tuned into Renegade Files, your pirate radio station broadcasting tales of paranormal adventures, unsolved mysteries, and bizarre cultural phenomena. I'm your host Lex Gordon, coming to you from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files, episode 137, Stockholm Syndrome, Loving the Enemy. The disclaimer for this episode is, I am not a doctor. The information in this episode is purely for the entertainment and intellectual exploration of the curious, and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease, mental or otherwise. Stockholm Syndrome is a disputed psychological theory that describes a situation where a hostage or abuse victim develops positive feelings and empathy toward their captor or victimizer, sometimes even defending them. It was named after a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden, and it is not included as a formal mental disorder diagnosis in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the authority on diagnosis and psychiatric conditions, which is used in the United States. Psychologists generally consider evidence for the condition to be shaky at best, and Stockholm Syndrome has been categorized as pop psychology by some psychologists. However, the definition of what Stockholm Syndrome is does seem to accurately describe a certain set of human behaviors that would otherwise be illogical. So, Stockholm Syndrome may not be recognized clinical psychology mental disorder, but it can be a valid term for having a discussion about the phenomenon. On this episode, we will do just that, as we define and understand exactly what Stockholm Syndrome is, then open the case files to look into a few of the most important examples where actual events came to define the term. So join me now, and together we'll investigate the odd and unusual circumstances that have resulted in hostage besties, victims defending villains, and all of the unexpected juxtapositions surrounding the controversial pop psychology diagnosis of Stockholm Syndrome, loving the enemy. You can find all things Renegade Files at therenegadefiles.com, your one-stop merch, bonus episodes, and RFA agency on Patreon, even more. Just visit therenegadefiles.com. Part 1. What is Stockholm Syndrome? In order to clearly define what Stockholm Syndrome is, let's first understand how a syndrome differs from a disease or an illness. A disease or illness is defined by the causes and specific symptoms of an affliction, whereas a syndrome refers to a collection of exhibited symptoms, typically behavioral, where the causes can be as varied as certain conditions, circumstances, responses, personality predilections, and reactionary mechanisms. So a syndrome is a collection of exhibited behavioral symptoms with varied causes that are typically situational. The exhibited behavioral symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome are siding with your captors, not attempting to escape given the opportunity, adopting your captor's enemies as your own, compassion for an abductor, negative feelings toward law enforcement or rescuers, attempts to help or defend the captors, rationalizing the captor's abusive behavior, and feeling powerless to escape the situation. So, where does this idea come from? The concept of Stockholm Syndrome arose in the 1970s as a result of mainly two incidents that occurred essentially back to back as far as big news events of the time. Less than 6 months apart, there was a Swedish bank robbery with hostages and a kidnapped socialite who went rogue. Both were extensively covered by the media and resulted in the idea of Stockholm Syndrome being defined and spread. Let's get into these two, shall we? Part 2. The Norrmalmstorg bank robbery. The first event was a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden that happened on 23 August 1973 by a man named Jan-Erik Olsson, which is every Swedish name together. This became known as the Norrmalmstorg robbery, named for the town square where the bank was located. Olsson entered the bank wearing a wig and black face paint, pulled out a rifle from his trench coat, fired a shot into the ceiling, and yelled, "The party has just begun." He released everyone in the bank except for 3 female bank employees that he kept for hostages. He soon discovered another employee, a man, who was hiding, so it ended up that there were 4 hostages, 3 women and 1 man. This was the first crime in Sweden to be covered by live television. The debacle lasted for 6 days as Swedish authorities negotiated with Olsson, the bank robber, and at some point, Swedish Minister of Justice Lennart Geijer agreed to Olsson's demand to have his former cellmate and friend, Clark Olofsson, brought from prison to the bank to assist Olsson in managing the hostages. It's extremely unusual, but they did it. It's weird that he would ask him that, but he also demanded that they send with Olofsson $3 million in cash, 2 bulletproof vests, 2 guns, and a Ford Mustang to escape in. Now, if it was weird that he asked them to bring his buddy from jail and they did it, it's really weird, to me at least, that he asked them to bring him some money while he's robbing a bank. Isn't it? But whatever. I mean, he also asked them for some guns, 2 bulletproof vests, and a getaway car. It's like, dude, did you not plan this at all? I mean, come on, man. Have you never at least watched a bank robbing movie? You gotta make a list. You gotta have an escape route, a diversion, the old double back double cross, or a man on the inside. I don't know, something. So anyway, they actually do send his buddy from prison, and it gives us some indication as to just how differently this situation would be handled by Swedish authorities in 1973 compared to virtually anywhere else in the world at any other time in history. So, as this was unfolding in real time, it was being filmed by Swedish TV crews, and even though 1973 was long before the 24-hour news cycle of cable, it was the top story every time the news came on. And it was also all over the radio and in every newspaper. It went on for 6 days. Some of the phone calls were recorded and replayed on the news. That is, the phone calls between the bank robbers and the, police. And one of those was with one of the hostages who actually spoke to the Prime Minister. And she said the robbers were treating them fine, and that she was more worried that the police might escalate the situation and harm or kill them all in the process. When the Prime Minister assured her that this would not happen, the hostage indicated that she didn't really believe him, and she said she felt like the robbers were actually protecting the hostages from the police. Now, it's not surprising that the hostages would fear to be hurt by the police busting in to take down the bank robbers. I mean, this is kind of why you take hostages in the first place. Because if it's just you alone in a bank while you're robbing it, then the cops can just bust in, guns a-blazing, and the whole thing is over in 5 minutes. The hostages become a barrier to police action. That's normal. What isn't normal is the hostages becoming so compassionate for the abductors that they start to side with them in, more dramatic ways. Now, things would change later about these opinions or about what was going on in there, at least to some degree, but this was early on in the whole thing. As it started to unravel, the police drilled a hole into the bank somewhere, I think through the roof and down into the vault. And Olsson saw it, and he shot at the hole at least once and injured a policeman in the hand and the face. I think he shot through the hole twice. He also dragged a female hostage into the view of the hole and put her in a chokehold to prove that he would kill one of them if authorities tried any funny stuff. The hostages were being kept in that vault, and one of them became panicked from claustrophobia. So she asked Olsson to let her walk around the bank. So he put a rope around her neck like a leash and proceeded to walk her in this way through the bank hallways and the lobby. She was apparently thrilled by this compassion and I guess his doing this for her. In fact, as she was being walked, she came into view of the police, and she was able to hold her hand out behind her with 4 fingers up without Olsson seeing her do this, to indicate to the police that there were 4 hostages. She later said that after doing so, she felt guilty for betraying the bank robbers. The other accomplice, Olofsson, that's the guy who came from prison, for some reason began walking around in the vault and constantly singing "Killing Me Softly" by Roberta Flack. Crazy. 6 days into it, the police finally used the hole they had drilled into the vault roof to pump tear gas into the bank, and the robbers and the hostages all came out, and the robbers were arrested without violence. As they exited, the hostages refused to let the robbers exit alone, and they all came out together so that the hostages could be sure that the robbers weren't harmed. Before the bank robbers could be whisked away by the police, the perpetrators and the hostages hugged, kissed, shook hands, and said tearful goodbyes to one another. In the aftermath, Olofsson, the guy who was called in from the prison to help, was acquitted and developed and maintained a long friendship with one of the hostages, Kristen Enmark. They visited multiple times. Their families grew very close, and Olofsson went on to commit several other crimes along the way while he was friends with them. Olsson, that's the main bank robber, served 10 years in prison, was released, and allegedly, very promptly, committed more crimes, and then he was on the run for over a decade. Then he finally gave up and turned himself in to Swedish police in 2006, only to be told that the charges were no longer being actively pursued. Can you imagine that? You're running from the police for 10 years and they aren't even really chasing you. You get exhausted from it all. You're like, that's it, I'm turning myself in. And they're like, don't sweat it, man. You're good. You can go. But this isn't a deep analysis of the actual Norrmalmstorg robbery. The point is that it's the incident that gives us the term Stockholm Syndrome. So this was obviously a huge story in Sweden at the time. And because it was covered by TV there, some of those clips made their way onto a few national news stories in the US. Then an article about the event was published in the New Yorker magazine. So this was probably the first time the idea of what would become known as Stockholm Syndrome began to spread in the American popular consciousness. And remember, you can get all things Renegade Files at therenegadefiles.com, your one-stop shop for merchandise, bonus episodes, the RFA agency on Patreon, and more. Just visit therenegadefiles.com. Part 3. Patty Hearst. A short time later, just after the Norrmalmstorg bank robbery, far away in California, 19-year-old wealthy publishing heiress Patty Hearst was kidnapped on 4 February 1974 from her Berkeley apartment by members of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or SLA, a small, far-left terrorist group who kidnapped Hearst and demanded the release of some other recently arrested SLA members. So up to this point, Patty Hearst was relatively unknown, especially in the public mind. She was a rich college kid at Berkeley, not terribly unusual, and she had never done anything particularly rebellious or surprising. She may have been leaning toward a bit of hippie idealism in some way, but she wasn't denouncing her enormous wealth or anything like that. She was engaged to a proper young man and was going about her life as a trust fund California college kid. what they call in California a Richie. Then she turns up missing from her apartment, and while it was discovered pretty quickly that the Symbionese Liberation Army had done it, because they referred to her capture in whatever way they made their demands to have their friends released, but beyond that, no one knew where she was, and there was a search for her for months. She's got money, her parents are well known, they're rich, they send out a manhunt, right? And just as a side note, the name Symbionese Liberation Army is a little misleading because it sounds like an organized paramilitary group affiliated with some country, but really the word Symbionese is a reference to symbiosis, which was a peaceful virtue the group espoused, even though they were kidnappers and violent bank robbers. And army was more like a dozen angry 20-somethings with a station wagon. They were against big business, and they blamed poverty and hunger on the rich, and so kidnapping wealthy heiress Patty Hearst was equal parts political statement and practical financing for the group, or at least that was the plan. But the state refused to release the SLA members that were in jail, so the SLA then demanded that Patty Hearst's rich family distribute $70 worth of food to every needy Californian, which would have cost at the time an estimated $400 million. In response, Patty Hearst's father took out a loan for $2 million, set up a project called People in Need, and started to distribute food to poor families. But the whole thing was immediately overrun with, allegedly, state of California mismanagement, fraud, and theft, and it ended in basic chaos and total ineffectiveness. Over the next 2 months, no one heard from the SLA or Hearst, and she was still not found. During this time, she lived, we found out later, mostly in a closet, held by the SLA, forced to live in a closet. She was given a flashlight and furnished with SLA essays and propaganda to read. Her life was constantly threatened if she didn't read the information and memorize it. She was kept blindfolded 100% of the times that she was let out of the closet, and that was only to eat. Eventually, she denounced her engagement, became sexually active with multiple members of the SLA as part of their sexual freedom policies, and she later would say that some of this was forced upon her. At some point, she was given the choice to leave or join them, and so she joined the SLA. She was given a new name, Tanya, and her blindfold finally removed. On April 3rd, 1974, 2 months after the kidnapping, Hearst announced on an audio tape released to the media that she had joined the SLA and adopted the name Tanya, a tribute to Che Guevara's comrade Tamara Bunk. 12 days after that, on April 15, 1974, Hearst was recorded on surveillance video wielding an M1 carbine while robbing a bank in San Francisco with some other SLA members. This is the iconic image of Patty Hearst in the bank with a machine gun. It was the first glimpse anyone had seen of her since the day she was kidnapped from Berkeley 2 months before. In the footage, Hearst yells, "I'm Tanya, up, up, up against the wall, mother expletives." But she didn't say expletives, right? 2 men entered the bank while the robbery was going on, and they were shot and wounded by the SLA. I don't think Patty Hearst did, but the other guys did. According to testimony at her trial, a witness said that Hearst had been several paces behind the others when running to the getaway car. This was an indication that she could have gotten away from them if she had wanted to. Right away, the news coverage and the public went wild with speculations, and the main phrase making the rounds right off the bat was brainwashed. After the robbery, an audio recording made by Patty Hearst, aka Tanya, was released again to the press, and in it, she said that the bank robbery was the SLA forcing the corporate state to finance the revolution. She also said, quote, "Consciousness is terrifying to the ruling class. I am a soldier in the People's Army." End quote. This becomes a huge media play for months. The SLA commits other crimes and they're chased around California, and I think this goes on for well over a year. Patty Hearst continues with them. She makes some other audio and press release statements along the way, and she almost becomes their most eloquent spokesperson for quite a time. The country gets sort of divided on the whole thing. Some people are like Team Tanya, saying, go Patty, and others are shocked and horrified, fearful for their own kids at college, worried about the far left ideas of communism and pointing to these bank robberies and killings as symptoms of that ideology. Others are convinced and trying to convince everyone else that Patty Hearst was brainwashed and that she's a victim in all this. She's obviously being coerced and abused and used as a tool by the SLA. The issue with that is that in what little footage and few photos we do get of her at the time, like the iconic image of her with the rifle in the bank, she looks great. She looks like a movie star in an action film. She looks like a Bond girl femme fatale. She got like a black headband. She's all sleek and makeup. She's got a black jacket with a rifle. So a lot of people were like abused and hypnotized and brainwashed. I'm not buying it. Then when you hear her speak on these audio tapes being sent to the news, she sounds very competent, very deliberate. She doesn't sound under duress at all. Long story short, the police eventually track down the SLA. They raid the hideout, get into a shootout, and 6 members of the SLA are killed. The rest are arrested, and thus ends the SLA. Tanya/Patty Hearst wasn't there at the time, and she disappears for another 16 months after that. In that time, she was living in a house with the remaining 3 SLA members when police finally tracked them down and they arrested her. Everyone there. When she's booked into jail for bank robbing and other crimes, she lists her occupation as urban guerrilla. Her wealthy family hires attorney F. Lee Bailey to represent her in court. F. Lee Bailey is one of the most famous American lawyers. He was part of O.J. Simpson's dream team. F. Lee Bailey uses brainwashing and Stockholm syndrome in her defense. But in light of much evidence, including Hearst in her own words, the jury doesn't buy it, and she's sentenced to 7 years. She gets released in 20 months, with her sentence, being shuffled off by President Jimmy Carter, and she eventually gets a full pardon from President Bill Clinton. She then goes on to recant everything she had said and to denounce her time with the SLA, saying that it was all basically forced upon her and she did what she had to do to survive. And some people feel sympathy and believe her, and others think that she's just another rich kid that got away with atrocities. All of this brings Stockholm Syndrome into the public awareness. Which leads us to Part 4. How the phenomenon develops. According to psychiatrist Frank Oakberg, Stockholm Syndrome evolves over several key occurrences and develops as a coping strategy. According to him, quote, "First, people experience something terrifying that just comes at them out of the blue. They are certain they're going to die. Then they experience a sort of infantilization where, like a child, they are unable to eat, speak, or go to the toilet without permission. Small acts of kindness prompt a primitive gratitude for the gift of life. The hostages experience a powerful, primitive, positive feeling towards their captor. They are in denial that this is the person who put them in this situation. In their mind, they think this is the person who is going to let them live." End quote. But many who have been in the situation and have displayed what might be called Stockholm Syndrome reject this term. For example, Natasha Kampusch, an Austrian girl who was kidnapped at the age of 10 by Wolfgang Perkoply and held captive in a cellar for 8 years, went on to finally escape. On the day she escaped, Perkoply, who knew the police would be coming for him, ended his life by jumping in front of a speeding train. When she heard the news, Natasha cried inconsolably for hours and lit a candle for Perkoply in his memory. In an interview, Natasha said, quote, "I find it very natural that you would adapt yourself to identify with your kidnapper, especially if you spend a great deal of time with that person. It's about empathy and communication. Looking for normality within the framework of a crime is not a syndrome, it's a survival strategy." And that's pretty well thought out and eloquent for an 18-year-old girl who was kidnapped and held captive from the time that she was 10. So I get that. But it's really just another way to say the same thing. No one ever said Stockholm Syndrome wasn't, at least at some levels that it seems to manifest, a survival strategy. But we see things like this in other situations for sure. I've heard more than one story, and I'm sure you probably have too, about an inner city neighborhood that's abused and exploited and subjected to random violence by the neighborhood drug dealers, but then no one in the neighborhood will cooperate with police when they come to arrest the criminals. Of course, part of that may be fear of retaliation, but not always. Sometimes you have this neighborhood protectionism that exists even for those who steal everyone's stuff, get the neighborhood kids addicted to drugs, and wreck the entire place. Some people in the neighborhood view the authorities and the overall criminal justice system and the controlling state as the reason kids might turn to a life of crime in the first place. They sympathize with the criminal, but feel distanced from the authority. And this is something a bit different from the, broadly speaking, Italian code of silence and honor known as omerta, which insists silence in the face of questioning authorities or outsiders, and a general non-cooperation with the government. It's like Jimmy Conway says in Goodfellas, the two most important rules: keep your mouth shut and never rat on your friends. But Stockholm Syndrome is far more complicated than just that. We see hints of this same phenomenon when people who are abused not only stay in abusive relationships, but defend and fight for their abusers. This gets extremely complex. For example, an abused wife might call the cops, but when they get there, she refuses to cooperate, refuses to press charges, and even berates the police and becomes part of the problem for them on the call that she herself initiated. It's almost like a cliche. It gets into 1,000 reasons. Like she shows the guy or thinks that, or, okay, let me just say this properly. So for example, she knows that the guy will get out eventually. Okay, right. She fears for herself in the long run. That's understandable. Often alcohol and drugs are involved, so emotions and decisions and actions are impaired to various degrees, sometimes to uncontrolled degrees. There might be other people involved that we or the police have no clue about. Relationships are messy sometimes, and abusive ones even more so. But the overall phenomenon of Stockholm Syndrome is the unexpected behavior of a person not just empathizing with a captor, abuser, kidnapper, or other criminal abusing them in some way, but the idea that they go so far as to join their side, their cause, or their fight. Tap follow real quick wherever you're listening to stay connected and help the show thrive. Stockholm Syndrome remains one of those ideas that sits in that space between psychology, criminal behavior, and public perception. Whether it deserves to be recognized as a formal diagnosis is still debated. But the behaviors associated with it, have appeared often enough throughout history that they continue to challenge our assumptions about how people respond to extreme situations. What makes the phenomenon so fascinating is that it conflicts with what we expect. We imagine that victims will always hate their captors, resist them, and seize the first opportunity to escape. Many do. Yet in some cases, we find empathy, loyalty, and even a willingness to defend the very people responsible for their suffering. The 1973 Stockholm bank robbery and the Patty Hearst case shaped the public understanding of this term and sparked conversations that continue today. Later cases, along with observations from psychiatrists, survivors, and law enforcement, suggest that the human mind is capable of remarkable adaptations when survival is at stake. Fear, dependency, isolation, and the hope of staying alive can influence behavior in ways that seem irrational from the outside. Human behavior under extraordinary pressure is rarely simple. People can make decisions, form attachments, and develop coping mechanisms that appear contradictory unless we look at those situations as survivalism. Stockholm Syndrome may remain controversial, but the questions it raises are valid. They remind us that the human mind is resilient, adaptable, and sometimes deeply mysterious. Understanding these complexities brings us a little closer to understanding ourselves, especially in circumstances most of us hope to never have to face. Thank you sincerely for exploring Stockholm Syndrome with me. Yep, this was kind of a short one, but short and sweet is good sometimes. Subscribe or follow the show now so together we can meet here next time and explore the deepest stories of weird culture, UFOs, aliens, hauntings, cryptids, conspiracy theories, and ghosts. I'm so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. Please get your bonus episodes and help the show continue by becoming an RFA agent on Patreon, which you can find at therenegadefiles.com. Thank you so much to the RFA agents there already. And if you aren't one yet, jump in there for free for a whole week and get all the cool stuff I've made for you there. Thank you. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, rogue planet child.